I can. Thumbs up. Good evening and welcome to From the Stacks. Seems like the whole world is bent on pursuing what people are calling net zero. Net zero of what? Well, net zero emissions of carbon dioxide thought to be causing catastrophic global warming. And people just all over the world in government positions seem to be pursuing this at breakneck speed, I think with very little consideration, or certainly inadequate consideration, of the costs of doing this. There's tremendous hopefulness and not an awful lot of clear, careful analysis. Our guest tonight on From the Stacks, Francis Menton, is going to bring a lot of clarity to that for us. He's written a number of really outstanding articles on his website, Manhattan Contrarian, that we have uh, been able to reproduce on the Cornwall Alliance's website as well. And that's with his generous permission. We will bring him on in just a minute. First, I'd like to just point out to you that the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a nonprofit 501c3 organization working to educate the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor around the world, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, together with the worldview, the theology, and the ethics that come along with that. Our concern is to be able to pursue policies that simultaneously take good care of the earth, protect the natural environment, and facilitate the conquest of poverty for those parts of the world that still suffer severe poverty. Certainly nothing that Americans are used to seeing in our country. So that's what our work is focused on, and we always try to provide every month an educational resource for people. This month we are offering as our way of saying thank you when you give any amount, no matter how small or large. We prefer that it be large much of the time, but when you give any amount to the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, we will be glad to send you, if you request it, copy of this roughly 350-page book, Clean Energy Exploitations, helping citizens understand the environmental and humanity abuses that support clean energy. The authors are Ron Stein and Todd Royal, a couple of friends of mine. They were our guests on From the Stacks 2 weeks ago. You can still go back to our Facebook or YouTube pages and see that interview if you like. It was quite informative. The book reveals how in China and the Congo and various other places, people are exposed to terrible toxicity in the mining of the rare earth metals that are essential to wind and solar power. And in many cases, it's essentially slave labor and sometimes child labor that is doing this. So this is a very important book that will help people to understand the ethical problems behind wind and solar renewable energy and the demand that we make a rapid transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So to request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in clean energy exploitations or promo code 22-02, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of this. 100% of your gift will be tax deductible. All right, so now I want to welcome our guest tonight, Francis Menton. 5 of whose recent posts at his website, Manhattan Contrarian, we've recently reproduced on our blog about the real costs of transitioning from fossil fuels to wind and solar for electricity. Francis, thanks very much for joining us tonight. And I've learned a trick from Robert Bryce, whom I'm sure you know. When he has folks on his show, his podcast, he always has them introduce themselves. So you've just walked into a small gathering of folks interested in this subject, and you get an opportunity to tell them about yourself, how you got into this, what interested you so much in it, and kind of what makes you tick.
Okay, I'm game. I should tell you that I live in Manhattan, and at a Manhattan cocktail party, one might want to be a little bit discreet when asked to introduce yourself and say what you think about this subject. I am not the kind of person who can be shut up easily once I get started, but I don't at cocktail parties make a point of offending people and getting them mad at me right off the bat. So, so I might not go into too much depth on this, but in terms of what makes me tick, well, my career, I was a partner of a major law firm for my career. I was with that firm for my whole career, from the start to the finish. I retired in 2016. And that was a very demanding job. So it didn't give me a lot of time to do much else. Uh, I got interested in the subject of climate change sometime around the early 2000s. I can't put a precise time on it, but it just seemed like something interesting to me because it seemed like one of those things that affects everything. If the world is in some kind of an existential crisis and we have to get rid of fossil fuels, that affects everything we do. It affects everything about our economy. And there were people proselytizing about this like it's something that is an existential crisis. It has to be done right away. We only have a few years. And and I was just scratching my head. I thought this is something that's of sufficient importance that I really need to find out about it. I need to research it. So I just started doing independent research. I don't think I came to it with any particular prejudice, one way or the other. I am a numbers guy. I majored in math back in college. Uh, and I kind of have a quantitative mind. And I started studying up on this. And the more I studied about it, the more I thought it just was completely ridiculous. It was just a mass hysteria of some kind. It seized upon the world, and not only uh, lots of people, but lots of the smartest people, lots of what you would think would be the smartest people. But it's not so different. I mean, I went to very fancy schools. I went to college at Yale. I went to law school at Harvard. And at that time, that was way back in the 70s. But I was astounded at how many of the very smartest people had fallen for Marxism
Yeah.
and and loudly proclaimed themselves to be Marxists. And I was like, how could you be such an idiot? It's completely failing. I mean, these were the days of Mao's great leap forward and the killing of millions of people and Pol Pot and
Yeah.
and such. And yet there were people loudly and proudly proclaiming themselves to be Marxists. Well, and there's still quite a bit of that, but somewhere along the line, climate change somehow supplanted that. But some of the very, very smartest people have completely fallen for
Yeah.
this. And I just think
Yeah.
if you're smart and you've got a day to look at it with a critical mind, you realize there's nothing to it. So there you go.
Yeah. Right. All right. Yeah. And thank you, by the way, in some email correspondence before the show today, you caught me in a mathematical error that would have been rather embarrassing.
Well,
God.
that's one of my specialties.
Yeah, right. Well, it's not one of mine, so I'm glad to have people check me on that. Yeah, it's remarkable. Um, there was a psychologist who, back in the 1950s, wrote a major study. I've forgotten the title right now, on groupthink, and he pointed out that so-called experts, the smartest guys in the room, tend to be the most prone to groupthink for a variety of different reasons. One of them being that, if you are supposed to be an expert in a given field, well, you have to have the respect of all the other experts in the field, and that means you better not rock the boat. You know, the only time when you might do that is when you've made some sort of a new discovery that is so profound and so absolutely solidly supported by the facts, by the logic, that there's no way that you're going to be taken down about it. And other than that, you go along to get along, or else you lose your reputation as an expert. So yeah,
or
I
your
think
career.
yeah,
The university system excludes dissenters more, and they always did, but it's more and more ruthlessly as time goes on.
yeah. And the irony is that it's if anything, it is more exclusive, more what intolerant of variety of ideas than, oh, for instance, most of the religious community, or even a lot of political parties. The universities seem to be even more insistent on uniformity of thought, which is absolutely just unthinkable. I think to anybody who really values the importance of iron sharpening iron, as one of the proverbs puts it.
It seems
Well,
like the opposite of what a university should be about, but that's where they
it
are.
does. It does. Well, I'd like to start by looking at your article, calculating the full costs of electrifying everything using only wind, solar, and batteries. In it, you reviewed several different studies by Roger Andrews, Thomas Tanton, and Ken Gregory. Um, if you can start by just telling us a little bit about who these three men are, when they did their studies, and what makes their work important.
You mentioned Roger Andrews and Ken Gregory. By the way, I've never met any of these people. I have great
Yeah.
admiration for them. Who was the third?
Let's see, Roger Andrews, Thomas Tanton, and Ken Gregory.
I
Tanton,
never met him either. Um, I think
yeah,
Tanton's work was what set Gregory off. So I won't emphasize his work because Gregory was really criticizing his work,
right,
although he, let's say, started off in the right direction but didn't go
yeah,
far enough. So Roger
yeah,
Andrews and Ken Gregory are two people who I've never met. Roger Andrews was a retired guy. I think he was in his early 70s. And in the period of about the 2000 teens, uh, he was a regular and frequent poster on a website called Energy Matters.
hmm
And I think he must have had an engineering background. He clearly was a math kind of a guy. And he decided to, retired, independent, self funded, not associated with any university, but he just was scratching his head about how these wind, solar, battery systems could possibly work. And he decided to create a spreadsheet to see how much battery storage in gigawatt hours it would take to uh, to back up a system using only intermittent wind and solar power generation with all fossil fuels, all nuclear banned and gotten rid of because the Greens aren't okay with that. So we only have intermittent wind and solar. We can back it up with batteries. And how much gigawatt hours of storage would you need for that? And he created a spreadsheet on that. And he posted it on this website called Energy Matters. He took two cases, which were California and Germany. Those happened to be two places where he could get hourly. I'm trying to remember if he used hourly or daily. It doesn't really matter for these purposes. I think it was hourly data for generation from their wind and solar system, excluding everything else, and then hourly data for their usage. So you could take a whole year, and you could, but the wind and solar generation wildly fluctuates up and down from 100% of capacity right down to zero, and you never know when. And wind over a course of a year averages about 35% of capacity generated. Solar is only 20 to 25%, much less because you start out with night and it doesn't generate anything at night. And cloudy days knock it way down. So you barely get 20 to 25% from solar. And it's very seasonal. Solar is, I mean, we have much longer days in the summer. Spring, fall, and winter tend to be cloudier also. So solar is very seasonal. Wind is also remarkably seasonal. Almost everywhere has more wind in the spring and fall, less in the summer and winter, because there are long calm periods in the summer and winter in most of the northern hemisphere, and that was true in both California and Germany. He got exact data. So, and he created a big spreadsheet to figure out how much storage it would take. And he published this information with all his assumptions and all his calculations on this website, Energy Matters. And he did the data came from 2017. He did the work in 2018, and he died in 2019. So that's what I know about Roger Andrews. He lived in Mexico, but he was American who I think had retired there.
And sort of the lowdown of his analysis for the U.S. was that you would increase the cost of electricity by 14 to 22 times by going entirely to wind and solar plus batteries. I mean, because you can't just go to wind and solar, period. You have to go to wind and solar plus backup storage. And that
you have
storage,
to have backup.
it counts for an awful lot of the price. So what happens then? We're talking about. Go ahead.
It turns out that as you push the wind and solar closer to 100% and you phase out the fossil fuel, the storage far and away comes to be the dominant part of the cost. Yeah. And that's shown by the spreadsheet. You have to look at a spreadsheet to see how this works.
Yeah. But the sort of the lowdown is that you increase the cost of electricity to end users by anywhere from 14 to 22 times. You know, what that means for the average US family, the average US residential user, is that annual cost rises from about $1,410 to about $19,728 or $31,000. That's
may I
pretty
say,
remarkable.
And this goes to the difference between Andrews' work and Gregory's.
Yeah.
Andrews was only making a calculation of replacing the exact amount of energy produced and used in California in 2017 with a wind and solar system relying on weather that generated power from wind and solar with the exact pattern of intermittency of 2017, and only generating the total of electricity that California actually used that year. Gregory asks a different question, which is, if net zero, you have to remember that electricity is only about 1/4 of our annual use of energy. So net zero says we are going to electrify everything and multiply our use of energy by a factor of 4. So all of our cars will be electric cars. All of our trucks will be electric trucks. Agriculture has to be electrified. Steel mills have to be electrified. Industry has to be electrified from top to bottom. Airplanes have to be electrified. I have no idea. Nobody's even remotely figured out how to electrify airplanes.
If you
But
have to have 1,000-pound battery to run a Tesla, what weight battery would you have to have for a 747?
right, and I haven't made that calculation, but the obvious problem and the obvious impracticality of electrifying airplanes with batteries is that the batteries are very, very heavy and undermine the whole proposition of flight and require a huge amount more energy to fly the plane than if it's powered by uh, aviation gasoline.
Yep.
But so Gregory took did a very similar calculation to Andrews, but he did it not just for California, but for the whole United States. And he also assumed full electrification of the whole economy. And now the numbers go completely insane. Now, who is Ken Gregory? Again, I don't know the guy. He's an independent guy. He appears to be retired. He appears to live in Calgary, Alberta.
Mhm.
There's a group of people up there in Calgary called Friends of Science,
Yes.
and uh, he is one of the leading lights of that and one of the main guys who posts on their website. And he's a guy, I guess, not so different from me, just an independent guy who's interested in this issue and said, let me do some calculations and see what I come up with.
And one of the nice things about that is precisely that you're not you're not relying on his reputation. You're not relying on his credentials. You're not relying on his employment position or anything like that. You're simply relying on the data he presents and the reasoning he uses with those data. And anybody can look at those and reason them out for himself. So instead of turning to an expert to tell you how to think and what to think, you're turning to somebody who is thinking and showing you his thinking process as it happens, and you can retrace it and check it all. I think this is to me, it's a significant difference between most of the folks on the climate alarmist side who are constantly saying, trust the science, follow the science, depend on the experts, or on the consensus of experts. And of course, consensus is not a scientific value; it's a political value. Versus the critics of this tend to put all their cards on the table. They tend to show you exactly how they are uh, arriving at their conclusions. What are their hard data? What are the logical ways that they're connecting those data together? You can test these things. So I particularly appreciate people like Gregory, like Andrews, who do this not as professionals, but as people or like you, as people who just simply have realized this is an important issue and it's something that ordinary people ought to have a hand in figuring out for our country. We can't trust it to the experts.
Well, I think you've made an excellent point, or maybe more than one excellent point there. And if you try to study up on climate science, uh, all the questions of CO2 and its effect on world temperature and how that works and how these climate models work. Uh, First of all, it can get very complex. The math is not easy. A lot of it is computer programming. Anybody's ability to study these millions of lines of code and figure out if it's all a fallacy or if they've just assumed the conclusion. I think the code of a lot of this stuff is actually available, like the climate models, but I couldn't figure it out. You couldn't figure it out.
No.
So they've got a black box that you can't penetrate, and they just say, trust us, we're the experts. On this
Yeah.
subject of how much battery capacity would it take to back up wind and solar, this is an exercise in arithmetic. It's
Yeah.
nothing that you didn't learn by the time you got out of the sixth grade. Now, it's advanced arithmetic in the sense that it involves a lot of addition and subtraction and multiplication and division. It's not just a one page worth of calculations. And if you want to do it in a short period of time, a spreadsheet program would be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
But it's just arithmetic. There is nothing
But
more
it's not
complicated.
differential equations.
It's not differential equations.
Right, right. So, what did Gregory conclude in terms of the cost of going to an all-wind, solar, and batteries electric system for the U.S., electrifying everything? Um,
So
Stunning
his
number.
case includes electrifying everything. So it means essentially 4 times more electricity generation and usage than we currently have. And I mean, but he lays out all his assumptions. He does assume quite a high cost of battery storage, which I think is $439 per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
Uh, um, but his calculation, he comes up with the United States would need something like 400,000 gigawatt hours, which of battery storage. So you have to multiply that by a million, and you get 400 billion kilowatt hours.
400 trillion. 433 trillion was his
Well,
conclusion.
433 trillion is the cost. 433 trillion is the cost at
Dollars.
$439 per
Yeah,
kilowatt hour for battery
yeah,
storage. I mean, it's
yeah.
completely ridiculous. Now, I don't know how much your viewers know, but the entire US GDP, gross domestic product, for a year is about 21 trillion. So he's calculating that it would take 20 times that to build out a system of wind, solar, and batteries, the huge majority of which is for the batteries. And and that's just to build it out once. Then you have to replace it every 20 years, or another way of putting it is 1/20th a year. So it's the full GDP of the United States every year ad infinitum,
Indeed.
supposedly to do this. Well, that means, of course, there's nothing to eat, there's no housing, there's nothing, because the entire GDP is devoted to building batteries.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you mentioned, Gregory did use what you think may be too high a cost for battery storage. You note that the cost of battery storage is declining over time, uh, but even when you account for that, it doesn't reduce that total cost by a huge amount, and it still is many multiples of U.S. GDP to build out the whole system. Uh, you also pointed out, though, that Gregory may be assuming a little too good performance in terms of actual charge delivered by the batteries. He was assuming 90%. Uh, why did you question that?
Well, I am certainly not an expert on how batteries work, but by charge delivered, that would mean um, if you put a kilowatt hour into a battery on Tuesday, or let's say into your cell phone on Tuesday, and you want to use the cell phone on Wednesday by the battery, how much of that kilowatt hour are you going to get back? And so Gregory is assuming 90% on the turnaround. I've seen other numbers in the 80% range.
Mhm.
That's not a huge difference to the bottom line of Gregory's calculation. I think what is a huge difference to the bottom line of Gregory's calculation is is if the turnaround, if you're charging the battery with solar cells in June, because that's when the sun is shining, and you're discharging them in January,
Right.
is how much of a turnaround are you going to get then, if any? If
Yeah.
any. Is the battery going to have anything left at all by the time January comes around? And this
Yeah.
is like if you leave your car if you leave your car in the garage and don't turn it on for 6 months, is it going to start? And
Yeah.
chances are it's not, right?
Yeah.
Because batteries don't hold charge for that long. And
Yeah.
and
And
that technology doesn't exist.
yeah, and that's part of the problem, we're going to get to that in a little bit, is that, as you pointed out a while ago, wind tends to be the best in the spring and fall, and solar tends to be the best in summer. Absolutely is the best in summer, but basically from about October through early March, you don't have much from either wind or solar. And so consequently, that's the period during which you have this enormous shortfall in the amount of electricity available to the system in terms of immediate generation. So you've got to have this storage backing up that can function months after it's first generated. That's the real issue, and it really drives up the cost of the whole thing. And then, of course, you also point out that Gregory does not discuss the problem of the need for expanding the transmission system for all of this. Why
Well,
is that relevant, and how?
I think he mentions it, but he doesn't include additional. He doesn't include specific additional assumed or calculated costs for that. So
Right.
he doesn't
Yeah.
say, here's how much that would cost. And again, well, the exercise he's doing is a pure arithmetic exercise that can be done based on knowing nothing more than data you can collect on what wind and solar generators have produced historically, on electricity usage as it has happened historically, and uh, uh, multiplying the electricity usage by 4, but assuming that it occurs in the same daily and seasonal patterns throughout the year, and then you just do a, a set of arithmetical calculations to figure out how much storage you have to build up at at a at a peak time of the year, which would probably be late summer or fall, beginning of the fall, and 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 then that would run down to zero by approximately the following March, at which time there's enough sun and wind that it starts building back up again. So you have to build power or build energy in your batteries for months on end and then run them down for 6 months to near zero. I think Gregory also assumes you're charging up to 100% and going down to zero, which is not how lithium ion batteries work. They're definitely recommended not to go above 80% and below 20. And you could see that that difference right there would drive, instead of being able to use 100% of your battery storage, you can only use 60%. It's going to cause your cost to go up by approximately
Yeah.
70% more.
Yeah. Right. Now, we've been talking about geographically large areas and large populations, California or the whole United States. Um, uh, you have suggested in another article on uh, how about a pilot project to demonstrate the feasibility of fully wind solar battery electricity generation. I'd like us to get into that in just a moment. First, I want to invite our viewers. You can ask questions of Francis Menton or me, although Francis is far more the expert than I am. You can ask questions just by using the chat box on either Facebook or YouTube, and our producer will call those to our attention, and we will try to answer those for you during the program. If we don't get to them during the program, the Cornwall Alliance staff will see if we can answer them online for you later. But I would invite you to do that. Ask questions. This is a great opportunity. Second, just a reminder that for the month of February, as a way of saying thank you when people donate any amount and ask for it, we'd be glad to send this 350 some page book, Clean Energy Exploitations, Helping Citizens Understand the Environmental and Humanity Abuses that Support So-Called Clean Energy. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, write in clean energy exploitations or promo code 22-02, and we'll be glad to send you a copy. 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. So now, as I said, we've been talking about large scale projects, but you suggest that it would be really helpful to have a pilot project demonstrating the feasibility of all of this stuff. And you point to an island in the Canary Islands off the coast of Spain, the island of El Hierro, which relies on pumped storage. So to start off with that, tell us how pumped storage works.
Well, pumped storage is a form of energy storage. So a battery is a form of energy storage, but pumped storage simply relies on water. Uh, you pump it up a hill when you have excess uh, electric generation, and then when you have not enough electric generation, you let it run back down the hill or the cliff through turbines like you have at a waterfall like Niagara Falls, and that generates electricity. So the concept is simple enough. So it is a means of energy storage and may be the most cost-effective means. Uh, it lithium ion and nickel lead and all these other kinds of batteries are like complicated chemical processes. This is just pumping water uphill and letting it flow back downhill again. So it's a means of energy storage. The drawback, if you'll call it that, is there aren't a lot of really appropriate sites where you can have a controlled reservoir hundreds of feet up and another reservoir hundreds of feet down right next to each other. The number of obvious sites to do that in the world is not high.
Yeah. And El Hierro, this island happens to have a volcanic cone about 2,000 feet above another reservoir. So they use this volcanic cone to store the water, and then they can release it later on when they are not actually generating from the wind or the solar. But as you point out, that's just not a common situation geographically or geologically.
Not only that, but it's not just that you could say, "Oh, let's put water in this cone." I mean, they had to line the thing with concrete, and they had to build a whole system of pipes and turbines and so forth to turn it into an electric generating facility.
Yeah. And what's been sort of the experience of El Hierro? What percentage of their electricity have they been able to reliably produce this way versus what they've had to continue to produce with fossil fuels?
Well, the obvious point is buried in your question there, which is before they built this wind, they built a bunch of wind turbines to go with this pumped storage system. And before they built that system, the island's electricity was generated from a diesel plant. So the first question is, can you get rid of the diesel plant and just use the turbines and the pump storage? And the answer is absolutely not even close. And you asked the question of how much of their electricity can they reliably generate? Well, my friend, this is wind and solar. You can't generate any reliably. So they put out, El Hierro has as websites, this thing called Jarono del Viento or something in Spanish. And that's their reservoir that you can see lined with concrete. They put out statistics so you can see what they've generated. And in some years, they've generated over 50%, maybe even close to 60. 56, I think, was the highest I saw. from the wind and pump storage system. But then in another year, I think 2020 was a bad wind year, and suddenly it was 42%. And
Yeah.
they're relying on the diesel generator then for 58%. If you go to their website, it's all happy talk about tons of CO2 emissions um, avoided, but and they did avoid some CO2 emissions clearly. But on the other hand, there was a pretty big expense in putting up all these wind turbines and the reservoir. And the same guy, Roger Andrews, did a calculation of what the cost of this system would come to in terms of cents per kilowatt hour for an electric bill, and he came to something around 80 cents a kilowatt hour. By comparison, the average price that an American consumer currently pays is about 12 or 13, and in states where you get gouged, like my state or California, you might pay 20, but this would be 80. The consumers don't pay it. It's all subsidized by the Spanish taxpayers. And so the consumers are all la-di-da, isn't this great? We have a wind and pump storage system. But in fact, if it was charged to them the way electricity is charged to everybody else, it would be 80 cents a kilowatt hour. And then the question is, suppose you wanted to build enough storage so that this thing could actually, you could get rid of the diesel system. How much would that take? And Andrews did a calculation of that, and he calculated that the reservoir would have to be 40 times bigger. 40 times.
And there's just not any way they can make it that. I mean, there isn't enough mountain there.
The whole island.
Right, right. Yeah, your article points out that in the final analysis, only about a quarter of El Hierro's final energy consumption is electricity. And so with the small amount of that that's actually being replaced by wind and solar from the previous diesel generation, this project has actually replaced barely 10% of El Hierro's fossil fuel consumption. So as an
Yes.
experiment in how to reduce fossil fuel use, this pilot project is not particularly promising, is it? But why is it that a pilot project particularly is such a good idea? Why first try to do that rather than on a very large scale?
I think nobody in their right mind would try to do this for 1 billion people unless you could demonstrate that it would actually work first at a smaller scale. I can't, has, has, I mean, how did we start out with electricity? Thomas Edison built one plant and he showed that it worked, right?
Yeah.
And then it started to build out from there. But that's
Yeah.
that's how you do it. You don't build a $1 trillion project before you show that it could work at a smaller scale. And they have this can't work. It can't work. And they have no idea. And they're building the $1 trillion project.
It's kind of like, if you want to tell me that you're going to run the country well, show me first that you've run your family well. Show me first that you've run your own small business well. Uh, and instead, people just want to start right off as president of the United States or as dictator of the world or something like that. And it just doesn't give an opportunity to get tested on the small scale. It does seem that it would be wise to start out with pilot projects. Well, another of your articles is titled, "What Solution Do Renewable Energy Advocates Offer for the Problem of Storage?" And you take aim at the widespread appeal by advocates of wind and solar to what they call, and more people call, I mean, this is a standard term, levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. Explain what LCOE is and why it's the wrong way to compare the costs of wind and solar with those of fossil fuels and nuclear.
This is one of the most incredible scams known to man, and it's a great example of how easy it is to fool smart people. Now, LCOE, I don't know who created it. It may have come out of the energy department. It's used by some of the investment banks that are promoting wind and solar projects. And I think it's levelized cost of energy, by the way, versus levelized cost of electricity, but it doesn't matter. It is, if you read one of the documents calculating comparative LCOEs of a natural gas plant, a wind turbine thing, solar panels, coal plant, nuclear plant, which there are many of these things, it will quickly have your head spinning with seemingly complicated mathematics. We got to talk about the life cycle of this thing. How long does this thing last? What discount rate should we use? How much capital are we going to need? How much transmission is associated? Starts to get into very complicated calculations. It seems like these people are very sophisticated, and everybody starts nodding their head. You have to look at it and say, are they leaving anything out? Well, for wind and solar, they're leaving out the whole storage piece, which is far and away the dominant cost as wind and solar get up to 50% and beyond of, and if you want to try to get rid of the fossil fuel backup. The storage is far and away the dominant cost, and it's completely left out.
Yeah. So it's not a question of how much does it cost to generate a gigawatt of electricity from wind turbines, from solar panels, from a natural gas plant, from a coal plant. That's not the key question. The key question is, how much does it cost to make sure that electricity in the vast quantities needed 24/7, 365, every single second of the day gets to the end user? And that is not just the cost of generating from wind and solar. It's the cost of generating from wind and solar plus the cost of storing their surplus during the rare times when they have it, and then releasing that storage at later times when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. And they just leave out, as you say, that entire second portion. So when folks say, well, the levelized cost of electricity from onshore wind is actually lower than the levelized cost from coal or even from combined cycle gas, they're just hiding the dirty fact under the table.
I don't really have much to add to that. I will tell you that it's just unbelievable how many articles I have read in seemingly authoritative news sources, from the New York Times, Bloomberg News, Washington Post, the major TV networks. Headline: wind is now cheaper than natural gas. And always relying on levelized cost of energy or some variant or tweak of that, and leaving out the cost of intermittency and the cost of making sure that that energy is firm and always available.
Yeah. So the customer, the buyer's got to beware, because there's a big hidden cost not even being talked about. Another of your articles is when the administrative state slips its constitutional bounds. And you point to several different ways in which you assert that the executive branch in the American government has exceeded its authority with regard to pursuing net zero carbon emissions. The Biden Executive Order 13990, issued on his first day in office, January 20 of last year, and the establishment of an interagency working group on the social cost of greenhouse gases, and the entry of the Federal Reserve into using banking policy to pursue climate change mitigation. Let's take those one by one. What was the problem with Biden's executive order?
By the way, there are plenty more of those. Well, Biden's executive order uh, is fairly long, but in simple terms, it simply says it is the policy of the federal government to reduce carbon emissions by anything we can do. Now, Biden sets policy, and policy is okay. He's allowed to do that. But in terms of taking actual actions, his job is to per the Constitution, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. That's his job. So, what is the law that says that he is allowed to suppress fossil fuels? There is the Clean Air Act, which comes from 1970 or so. It's been amended a few times. Obama realized that that's not going to do it for the suppression of fossil fuels, and he proposed a cap and trade program, which you might remember, that failed in Congress. Biden has now proposed the Green New Deal program. That has gone nowhere in Congress. So they don't have any specific legislative authority for what they're doing. Now, what are they trying to do in the administrative state, paying no attention to Congress? We control the administrative state, so we're going to try to suppress fossil fuels. How are they going to do that? Well, you mentioned Exhibit A, the social cost of carbon, which is that they're going to declare that carbon emissions are a gigantic cost to society, apparently ignoring the enormous benefits that fuels have provided to people in the form of electricity, transportation, computers, air conditioning, heat, whatever.
Which is not even to mention, by the way, the benefits of added CO2 in the atmosphere, causing plants to grow better, which means more food for everything that eats plants or eats something that does eat plants.
Yes, but so they've come up with something called the social cost of carbon, and they've managed to jack up the so-called cost of emitting CO2 in the atmosphere by using a very low discount rate, counting costs that are supposedly going to occur 100 and 200 years from now in other countries, and to put this number on things so that they can make that a part of the evaluation of any proposed project that requires any kind of government approval or permit, which any kind of big project these days does, and therefore they can disapprove any pipeline, they can disapprove any oil lease, they can disapprove any factory even that is going to use a lot of fossil fuels. Well, that got challenged by a bunch of states. We set up this program a couple of weeks ago, but just last Friday, a judge in Louisiana struck that down as unconstitutional. Now it's just one federal district judge in the Western District of Louisiana, Baton Rouge, but he wrote a big long opinion, which I would commend to your audience. And as of this moment, the entire federal government has been enjoined from applying or making any use of this social cost of carbon guidance that came out of this interagency working group. So that's kind of brand new news. And actually, I have a blog post on it just a couple of days ago. The decision came out on Friday.
Were you involved in that case?
I was not. I was not. And the case is broad. The main plaintiffs are a group of states, I think 17. states,
Uh-huh.
it's kind of the usual suspects of Republican states, and I think 10 of them who moved for the preliminary injunction are particularly in the energy production game, who are saying this is a direct harm to our states. So Louisiana took the lead on the case. Other states, I know Wyoming is one of the states, pretty sure Texas is one of the states,
Yeah.
and many of the big energy producing states.
Yeah, there have been some really, really serious criticisms of the whole way that the federal agencies, EPA and others, have gone about trying to establish a social cost of carbon. Kevin Diaratna and David Kreutzer from the Heritage Foundation have published a number of different papers where they point out that if you include the benefits in terms of increased crop yields for agriculture of added CO2 in the atmosphere, and if you use a more reasonable discount rate in terms of present value of future projected damage, and then if you use more realistic projections of global average temperature change, those that are based on more empirical observations rather than on modeling, you can actually wind up with what is termed a negative social cost of carbon. That is, the added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually is doing more, bringing more benefits than harms. In which case, if government wants to do something about this, it ought to be subsidizing rather than penalizing carbon dioxide emissions. But really, seriously, it seems to me that the best solution to this kind of thing is just put government back within its constitutional boundaries. And if the federal government, if the executive branch wants to address these things, it needs to wait on Congress to do its job to pass actual legislation, which so far it hasn't managed to do. And I think that's because the members of Congress realize they're not going to get reelected if they put enormous costs on their constituents. We talked earlier of multiplying the annual cost of electricity for a residential home to, instead of around $1,000 a year, to $20,000 or $30,000 a year. You know, how long do you think people are going to continue
You
to
are,
vote for politicians who put policies in place that do that?
um, I can't think of anything to disagree with what you just said. It's not just, though, it's not just, we talked about the social cost of carbon. This is everywhere right now in the federal bureaucracy. It's in the Federal Reserve. They're trying to keep banks from making loans to fossil fuel companies. It's in the SEC, which is trying to put the squeeze on fossil fuels by disclosure obligations in corporate documents. It's in there's a huge initiative going on in the Department of Energy, and there are initiatives in the Department of Agriculture. It is pervasive in the federal government right now that the bureaucrats think they run the show. They will do what they want. They are going to suppress fossil fuels on their own authority and just dare the courts or the people somehow to stop them. And and Trump tried to put the brakes on it to some degree. Uh, Biden, of course, immediately reversed it on taking office, and Trump didn't completely put the brakes on it either. Maybe the next Republican president and a Republican Congress can start to drive a stake through the heart of this beast. I don't know. I don't know. I tell you, I want to say one other thing, which is I really want one of the crazy states like California or New York to drive itself into a ditch, because that's how the rest of the people will learn how bad this
That's
is.
how the laboratory of democracy works. You know,
Yes.
uh, as let's see, who was it who coined that phrase, the laboratory of democracy? Uh, but at any rate, that was the founder's notion: was have all these states that do things differently, and that way we figure out what works and what doesn't work, and you don't have to subject the entire nation's population to a failed experiment. You can do the
Yes,
experiment in
democracy
just one state. Yeah,
absolutely doesn't want that to happen. They want it to be
yeah, right.
nationwide.
Yeah. So two other articles I want to turn to in a little time, and I hope you can stick with me past the top of the hour here for a little bit.
No problem.
Uh, One of your articles is titled "Two More Contributions on the Impossibility of Electrifying Everything Using Only Wind, Solar, and Batteries." You cite work by Lars Chernikau and William Smith estimating how much of various special minerals would be needed to produce all of Germany's electricity from wind and solar. And from the data that you provided there out of Chernikau and Smith's work, I've developed a couple of graphs. I've shown them to you previously in emails, and you corrected a couple of math errors that I did that first had one of these graphs quite wrong. Um, but I think these can be really telling in addressing this. And I'm sticking with, in this case, I'm sticking with just the minerals needed for solar, and really just two of those minerals, silicon and silver. But this is illustrative of a larger critique of the wind and solar industries, and that is that because they require some what are called rare earth minerals, which doesn't mean that they can't be found all over the earth. It means that they're in very uh, uh, dilute uh, proportion in any given cubic mile of the Earth's crust. Because of this, you have to mine enormous amounts of Earth to get the minerals necessary for the wind and solar. So what I did was I took some of those figures, and first I showed graphically what you have to do in terms of multiples of global production needed of silicon and silver to provide all of German electricity just from solar PV. And so that's this first graph here. At the left end, you've got the annual global production of silicon, blue, and silver, orange. And then the next three pairs of bars, you have the German annual need, which is about a tenth of total global production, or for silicon, and about 30% for silver. Now, at first glance, you might think, oh, okay, so that sounds doable. The problem is Germany's population is only a, a very tiny percentage of global population. So maybe other people around the world might want some of that silicon and silver for purposes in addition to solar panels. But then you get into the 15-year life cycle need, because basically you have to replace solar panels about every 15 years. Germany's 15-year life cycle need would be 1.5 times or 4.5 times global annual production of silicon and silver. And the very first year that you're doing this, you've got to set all of that stuff up. So the very first year, you're going to take about 1.5 or 4.5 times global annual production of silicon and silver. Um, Talk to us, if you will, Francis, about the implications of this for the idea that somehow or other we're going to make solar panels become a major contributor, a major percentage of our electricity source around the world.
Yeah, a couple of comments to start with. I would not call silicon or silver rare earths. Uh, there
That's
are a lot of
true.
rare earths. They're mainly, I mean, that's a particular technical term. The rare earths are
Yeah.
mainly things that are needed in the wind turbines rather than solar. And they have oddball names like niobium or iridium, and I don't even know what they all are. There's quite a few of them.
Neodymium.
Neodymium, right? Um, but silicon and silver are in two different categories. Silicon is
Great.
actually one of the very plentiful elements in the Earth's crust. And it is cheap and easily available. It's heavy and bulky and required. But for example, sand is silicon dioxide, and that's the main part of it. And rock is of every kind. It's mostly silicon. It can be hard to get the silicon out of it, but there's lots and lots of it around. Silver,
Yeah.
not so. As you were saying, silver is a rare metal and requires mining lots and lots of dirt to get a quantity of silver out. Um, what when you start thinking of the amounts of just stuff, the materials requirements for solar panels and wind turbines, and it turns out batteries, which is again the driving thing when you're considering really the driving thing when you're considering a fully wind solar battery system. The material requirements, we start calculating them, and you just realize how completely ridiculous it is. That calculation, which you showed, which is by two guys named Chernow and Smith, um, is just to build the solar panels to provide enough electricity for one country, which is Germany. And it's also assuming, for God, Germany is the cloudiest country in the world. So the last thing you want is to put them in Germany. So they're assuming you could put them in Spain, which has a much better solar profile, and then build transmission lines to take the power up to Spain. I don't know how, up to Germany. I don't know how France would feel about that, because that means a lot of big transmission lines going through France, but that's, that's another whole story.
Yeah. Right.
But this calculation assumes is asking, what do you need just for the solar panels? And assuming you could build them in Spain, you would need these enormous material requirements.
Yeah. And what I next did was I thought, okay, let's get some notion of what this would mean if we wanted to get all the electricity for the world just from solar. Okay. And no, this is hypothetical. It's for illustration only. Nobody is saying we should actually do this, uh, but it's just a way of trying to get some sense of the magnitude of what's in mind here. So I said, let's assume, because most people around the world do not use as much electricity as Germans do, or Americans, or anybody in Western Europe, Canada, and so on. You've got much of Asia, Africa, Latin America, where people use very, very little electricity. So let's assume for a moment that the whole world gets its electricity just from solar, but that the average person consumes only a tenth as much electricity as all of Germany. And what we come up with is this. Again, annual global production, we're just calling that one because we're going in comparisons here. And the global annual need for silicon and silver for this would be 95% and 2.85 times the global annual production,
I,
which means
I,
that basically there's no
that
silicon left to do anything else. And
I think
you
that
need,
annual current. It's not assuming
pardon?
building all these things. That's current.
Right.
In other words,
That's correct.
we're
Right.
currently using the silicon we're producing, and we're actually using a lot more silver than we are producing, because there's a lot of stock of it that gets reused.
Yeah. Right. And for the initial setup of all of this, if we can get that graph back up there, for the initial setup of all of this, the setup need, you'd need 12.8 times the annual global production for silicon and 42.71 times the annual production, global production for silver. Um, and again, you just have to say, who in his right mind thinks that the world is going to be willing to commit that much of its silicon and that much of its silver just to solar panels to generate electricity? It's the magnitude of these things that I think so many people fail to think about. Yes, can we produce from wind turbines or solar panels uh, enough electricity to run a city of 300,000 or even perhaps a city of 1,000,000? Yes, we can if we have enough of those panels and enough of those turbines. We have to occupy a great deal of land with them compared with the amount of land that we'd occupy with a coal or gas plant or a nuclear plant. But we can do that. But when you start thinking in terms of, say, the whole American uh, nation and its population, or the whole European population, or the whole population of the world, all of a sudden you realize this just doesn't cut it. And fundamentally, it drives us back to another issue, another concept, and that is the concepts, or two concepts of energy density and power density. Energy being a quantity measurement, and power density being a rate measurement, a flow measurement. The problem is that wind and solar are very, very low density sources of energy and power, whereas coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear are extremely high density sources of energy and power. And to to transform the low density energy in wind and solar into the extremely high density energy you need for an electric grid, it just simply costs a lot more than transforming the energy of coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear into that. So we just back right up again to the problem that, frankly, uh, for hundreds of years, we've realized, wind and solar are nice, but they're not best used to generate electricity, to provide power. Basically, they're a return to old-fashioned things, and old-fashioned things that got replaced by much more dense sources.
Well, I just want to make one comment about your chart showing it would take 42 times as much silver as current world production to provide the solar panels for world electricity, and
Yeah,
that and similarly 12 times current world silicon production to provide the solar
yeah,
panels. That's
yeah,
assuming that the remainder of the world outside the uh, advanced West is willing to live with 10%
thanks,
the
Jim.
per capita energy use. In other words, you're consigning the entirety of the poor people of the world to perpetual poverty there. And
Absolutely.
if you let them have the level of energy usage that we have here in the West, that 42 times becomes 420 times, and the 12.8 times
Exactly.
becomes 128 times.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't
So,
see why those poor people should be consigned to a lifetime of energy poverty. I don't see why at all.
and neither do I. And that is, frankly, Francis, that's what got me into all of this in the first place. As a little child, I lived in Calcutta, India. And literally, for a period of about 6 months, my ayah or nurse would take me by the hand early every morning and take me to the home of an Indian family where I spent the day. This was because my mother was critically ill during almost 6 whole months, so she couldn't take care of me. My dad was working at the state with the State Department at the time, and along the way, every morning, I literally stepped over the bodies of people who had died overnight of starvation and disease. I saw poverty of a sort that Americans just don't dream of. unless they have gone to places. And okay, yeah, we can see it in movies, but it just is not the same. Uh, I saw poverty that Americans don't begin to understand. And that poverty is a far greater risk to human well-being than anything related to climate. If you've got income like the bottom 5% of Americans, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. If you're living on the equivalent of $2 a day, you can't thrive in any climate, anywhere. So the whole notion that we're going to bring the whole world together in fighting climate change is, to me, almost profane, blasphemous, because what it does is it condemns the poor of this world to long-term remaining in poverty. And that, I think, is cruel and unjust, just morally unconscionable. So,
I'm
yeah,
sure you're
that means,
Prime Minister and the Environmental Minister of India have come out and absolutely explicitly said, we're going to develop our coal resources. We have the right to do it. You used
yeah.
yours, and we're going to use ours, and you can't stop us. And they've said that over and over.
And more countries all over the developing world are saying exactly the same thing. We've had a fellow write frequently for us for the last about 5, 6 years, Vijay Jayaraj. He is a climate scientist. He's Indian. He lives in India, and he gets these perspectives across to us and for our constituents, and it's something that has been really, really valuable to us. So, all right. So we've got one other item that I'd like to make reference to. Oops, where did I? There we go in my outline. Okay. Um, let's see. Uh, you have a, let's see. Oh, yes. In your article, California's net zero carbon plans, can anyone here do basic arithmetic?
They can't.
Crucial to that is the difference between gigawatts and gigawatt hours. Would you explain that and why it's so important to what California's planners have failed to do?
This is completely unbelievable that these people don't know this. It's like the most basic, simple element of competence to do this job if you're trying to plan for a net zero energy future. So, and I think you used the terms before, a gigawatt or a megawatt or a watt or a kilowatt. A watt, kilowatt is 1,000, megawatt is 1,000,000, gigawatt is 1,000,000,000. Is a measure, is a flow or a rate or a speed at which power is being produced. It doesn't measure the total amount of energy that is or has been produced. So a measure of the total amount of energy is the watt hour or the kilowatt hour or the megawatt hour or the gigawatt hour, which measures if so a gigawatt hour is if you were producing at the rate of 1 gigawatt for an hour, you got a gigawatt hour. If you were producing at the rate of 1 megawatt for an hour, you produced a megawatt hour. And if you're
Mhm.
producing at the rate of 1 megawatt for a year, you've produced a year's worth of hours. And if you are actually doing calculations in this field, you would know off the top of your head that's 8,760 hours. 365 times 24 is 8,760. So if you produce a megawatt at the rate of a megawatt for a year, you have produced 8,760 megawatt hours. If you want to do calculations of how much battery storage you need, well, megawatts are important because if you're dealing with New York City has a peak usage requirement of 20,000 megawatts approximately. So you're going to need batteries that can deliver power at the rate of 20,000 megawatts. And if they don't produce that fast enough, you're going to have a blackout. But for how long? A second, a minute, an hour? And when you do these calculations, you realize you need weeks upon weeks of power stored up to cover for the intermittency of wind and sun. So, so how many megawatt hours do you need to have stored up? And then you go to the California document where they calculate how they're going to get to a net zero economy, or you go to the New York document where they supposedly calculate how they're going to get to a net zero economy, and they never calculate anything in megawatt hours or gigawatt hours. It's like they don't even understand these units exist. It's a level of incompetence that is beyond breathtaking.
Right. Now, in that article, you have actually a pair of graphs, one on top of the other, showing the times of year in which there would be surpluses and deficits of electricity generated from wind and solar. And this is for California, and the consequent needs for storage. Uh, can you just walk our viewers through these two graphs here so that they
Yes,
understand? We made a little reference to it earlier.
these graphs were produced by Roger Andrews, and who we talked about earlier in this program. And he produced them in 2018 based upon. Do you know if this is Germany or California? He produced a set for
This was
Germany and another
California.
set. This is
This was
California.
California. Yeah.
So he produced one graph for Germany, another for California. They both look very, very similar to this.
Mm-hmm.
But what he had was at least daily or maybe even hourly. As I look at the chart, it looks like it's probably daily data for electricity production and consumption for California. And this is from their existing wind solar system. It turns out that California has much more solar than wind, which makes sense because it's a very sunny place.
Mm-hmm.
And he took their annual usage, and then he said, oh, okay. And by the way, their usage is about 40 gigawatts on average.
Mm-hmm.
So how many gigawatt hours do they use in a year? You multiply by 8,760 and you get some number in the 350,000 range is what they use in gigawatt hours in a year.
Mm-hmm.
But now he assumed let us ramp up our wind solar system. We'll just build more of these facilities and more and more and more in the same proportions until we have a system that produces that 350,000 gigawatts, the same amount we're going to consume. And then we're going to look at that system and see, based on the year 2017, actual generation patterns from our wind solar system when that energy was produced. And what you find out, and that the top chart basically shows that, and it shows it, you can assume that if what's up at the top is when it's producing the most. So it's producing the most in June, May and June, it looks like, and then in November, December, and January, it's producing less. But this is not actually a chart of how much is produced, but if we're gonna have batteries to store it up, when are they going to be getting filled up, and when are they going to be getting drawn down? So the green indicates they're getting filled up, and the red indicates they're getting drawn down. So you can see this system is providing more energy than is needed in April, May, June, July. I don't know why August in this particular year must have been a low wind and sun year. I don't know. September is building up again and then gets drawn down for the rest of the year. And then the bottom chart, and it has a title on it, which is called storage balance. shows how much is in the batteries. And you can see that he has normalized the system to the point that it it charges up to 100% and draws down to zero, and it hits 100% in August and it draws down to zero in March. And the total amount of storage that you're going to need is 25,000. Now that is assuming you never have a worse weather year than 2017. If you have a less windy and sunny year, these batteries may not do it. But this is how he gets to the calculation that you're going to need 25,000 gigawatt hours of storage for a system that uses about 350,000 or so gigawatt hours in total in a year. So, which basically is equivalent to about a 12th or a month's worth of energy stored to get you through a year.
Yeah. And the problem is that the cost of providing all that battery storage is just enormous. And
Well,
again,
25,000 hours. The cost used by Gregory was 400 and something a gigawatt hour. He got that number from EIA based, which is a U.S. government agency based on prices extant in the marketplace at a given point in time. You can assume that's going to come down. I think that Andrews used a number of in the range of 200 or 250 per kilowatt hour. And 250 per kilowatt hour, you got to multiply that by a million to get a gigawatt hour. So that would be $250 million per gigawatt hour times 25,000 gigawatt hours needed. And you're in the something in the $6 or $7 trillion range, which is a multiple of California's GDP.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, Francis, this has been really informative, very helpful to me. Reading your articles has been helpful to me, and that's one reason we're glad to pass them along on Cornwall Alliance's website. Do you have some concluding comments, particularly what can ordinary citizens do about this in terms of affecting public policy?
Well, I've taken to just speaking out. I've never been one to harass my representatives, of course, but then I don't have the same representatives as people out there in the rest of the country. I mean, I have Gerald Nadler, congressman, and Chuck Schumer for my senator, right? So what exactly am I going to accomplish by trying to send them letters? But I would strongly suggest that out there in your viewership are a lot of people who can write to their congressmen and senators and state representatives and say, I want no part of this. That's certainly something somebody can do. I've also thought of, I haven't tried it, but when we have climate demonstrations, we ought to have a climate counter demonstration by the people who say, you people are out of your mind. You're nuts. You have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, this isn't a close question. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, there's one thing that I think sort of stands in the way of doing that, and this gets into a little bit of sort of political psychology, I suppose. But the people who want to go out and change the world tend to be, they're the activists, and they tend to have a pretty high impression of their own brilliance. They're also, they tend to think collectively rather than individually, and the bigger the collective, the better. And they tend to have the attitude, I want to run other people's lives. And people like you and me don't tend to think that way. I don't want to run other people's lives. I want to leave people free to run their own lives.
But yes, and you probably don't read the New York Times. It's one of the other great things.
I do fairly frequently, actually.
But it's one of the. I bet you don't get print edition delivered to your front door every morning like I.
No.
But I mean, the New York Times has a new crisis that humanity is facing somewhere in the newspaper every day, and the solution is a new government program to fix it. In every case,
Exactly.
that is everything they know. That is all their mind can think of as how to improve the world is a new government program. They know nothing else.
Yeah. Well, that's a sort of a statist mentality. As a Christian, I would identify that as a form of idolatry, idolizing the state, putting it in the position of God, and that's just. I think it's been one of the ailments of humanity for millennia, and it will probably continue to be for a long time. We've had a wonderful experiment going on here called the United States, where the idea has been not to idolize the state, to try to leave people as free as possible. I think it's a very disturbing question whether we're going to be able to preserve that for very much longer. I hope we can. And I appreciate what you do because I think what you do contributes to that. So, Francis Menton, thank you very much for being my guest tonight. And I will continue reading your work and hope to have you on again sometime.
Great to be here. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you. And to all of you who joined us tonight, thanks again for doing so. And we will have, I just remembered my producer notified me that we had a question written in our Facebook feed. If we can still get that up, maybe we can address that. So, producer Jim, can you put that question in front of us? Or it's not a question, it's a comment. The reason China doesn't use as much electricity is because their government restricts certain parts of the country from having that luxury. Yeah, that's so. I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. During the rain seasons, there will not be enough energy to go to work in our electric cars. Hospitals will also not be able to utilize equipment that use a lot of energy. So much more disasters. Better learn how to make energy from water, from Gianna Smith. Thank you. And Chastity Holmquist. So discussing resource scarcity, how much land is needed to hold all this? Will it affect food productions? You want to take any one of those real quickly?
That last question is actually addressed in that Chernow and Smith article that we were talking about. They talk not only about um, the silicon and silver and whatever requirements for building enough solar panels in Spain to take care of Germany's electricity needs, but they also talk about how much land it would take, again in Spain.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact number. It's a significant part of the country, but I don't know if it would seem like all that much. Like maybe it would be 10 to 20%, but I don't remember that exactly. But of course, that's only to supply Germany. So how about France? How about and the reason these things are going in Spain is that Spain is the one with the sun. It's sunny all the time. So um, uh, well, I don't remember exactly, but I think that if you tried to supply all of Europe's electricity from solar panels only in Spain, you would cover the entire country. I'm pretty sure that's right.
Wow. Yeah, in fact, there was a Harvard study released, was it last August or the previous August? I can't think right at the moment now, that tried to answer the question, if we wanted to power the entire United States economy, and that's both what's already electrified and what needs to be electrified, or would have to if we wanted to do it this way, how much land would we have to cover with wind turbines? And their answer, put in very, very gross, stark, general terms, was to provide all the electricity that we now use, we just about have to cover everything from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi with wind turbines. And then if we wanted to electrify the entire transport fleet and all the other energy uses that are not currently electrified, we'd have to cover pretty much the rest of the land from the Mississippi to the Pacific.
And I
That
think
was a very gross and general way
as,
of putting it.
as we've discussed, I'm very into quantitative and trying to do ballpark estimates of those things. And I think those numbers are too high, but the real numbers are so dramatic as to be equally devastating.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 20% of the country. It's very large numbers, but when you start thinking about 20% of the country, you won't be able to go anywhere without seeing wind turbines covering everything, even if it's only 20% of the country.
And once upon a time, environmentalists cared about about the beauty of the land. No more. Well, again, Francis, thank you very much for joining us. All of the rest of you, thank you very much for joining us. Quick reminder, through the month of February, as our way of saying thank you, when you make a donation of literally any size and request it, we'll send you a copy of the book Clean Energy Exploitations. To request yours, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just enter Clean Energy Exploitations or the promo code 22-02, and we'll be glad to send it. Our guest next week will be Benjamin Zeiker of the American Enterprise Institute to discuss the case for climate change realism. So join us again then next Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Facebook and YouTube. Thanks a lot. Take care. Have a wonderful week, and God bless.